Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's session. I'm sorry I have no camera, but I have a camera issue once again. Today's session is Make a Business Case for Embracing Analytics with Tiana Van Dyke, the Senior Director of Client Services at Epic. So, like I said, you should all be set to mute for the presentation, but please do use the chat function to comment or ask questions, and hopefully we can save the questions till the end of the session. The session will be recorded, so ACEDS members will find it on our website after the event. Today, we'll learn some tips and tricks that will help you take your analytics game to the next level. Understand how to build a business case by analyzing key metrics and demonstrating the benefits of using advanced technologies. Leverage this insight to empower and encourage your case teams to rely on advanced analytics. By simplifying the discussion around these technologies, paralegals, law clerks, and lawyers can become more confident capitalizing on the cost process efficiencies. A little bit about our speaker. Tiana has over 15 years experience in the e-discovery field. Prior to her role as a Senior Director of Client Services at Epic, she was the Manager of e-discovery and litigation support at Burnett Duckworth Palmer. She leverages her experience to design e-discovery strategies that align with her clients' goals and configures creative technology solutions that are both scalable and cost-effective, balancing service, processes, and technology. Tiana holds a Bachelor of Kinesiology from the University of Calgary. She has served as a frequent speaker and consultant on the topics of e-discovery analytics and project management and document review, data visualization, change management, and leadership. She's also an integral part of our team to help create the Canadian version of the ACEDS manual and exam. And if you have not yet checked this out, please feel free to drop me a line and I can get you the information. And with that, Tiana, take it away.
Thank you very much, Monique. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who joined. This has been a lot of fun doing a partnership with ACEDS Vancouver chapter. So why don't we jump right in? We're going to talk about a few things today. The first being building a business case. And when I talk about building a business case, what I'm actually referring to is gathering what you need to support your case for using analytics and promoting analytics both to your clients and to your internal teams. So depending on where you are in your, I'm going to call it an adventure. Depending on where you are in this adventure of implementing advanced analytics, you may find that you struggle with something in particular. So what I want to talk about and what I want you thinking about as we go further into the presentation is think about what your clients and your company's goals are for using analytics. Because a lot of the decisions that you make are going to be impacted. A large oil and gas, I'm in Calgary, so a large oil and gas company may have a very different end goal with analytics than something like the local 7-Eleven. So you want to unlock resources. When you are building any kind of business case, you need to develop and build and plan for training, technology, vendors, and people. Without those things, you are going to struggle to have success because those are really the pillars of any kind of business. So using metrics to measure the impact of analytics. So take this back to what your company and client goals are. If you, for example, have a client who's incredibly cost conscious, the analytics that you will likely want to use are going to reflect that. If you have a client who is particularly data volume sensitive, that's going to be the analytics that are effective in building a business case to that client. So this one is kind of funny. So evolve, no business model works indefinitely. And what I'll say here is that when you have a really great idea, when you come up with a really good strategy, sometimes it can be easy to like rest on your laurels and assume that that is great and it's wonderful and it's going to last forever. And it isn't often, that's not often going to be the case. So I encourage you to plan in increments. So if you do not have an analytics program right now, probably getting from A to Z by the end of the year, it might not be particularly reasonable. So plan in increments, look to implement different pieces as you see fit. And also keeping that in mind will help you take the content from this presentation, regardless of where you sit in your life cycle, and make sure that you can apply it. So if the plan doesn't work, change the plan, not the goal. But the important part of this is it is important to have a goal at the outset when you are making your plan. So how do you start making a plan? You are going to want to look at your key priorities. And I think of that as, what are the common dilemmas that either I'm experiencing or my client is experiencing? I want to start addressing those things. If you think of a importance and difficulty matrix, you want to address the most important things that are the easiest to address first. That's going to get you like the biggest impact. And then you can start figuring out which other pieces of the puzzle are going to get you the most success. And that's going to depend on your clients and your company. So the strategies that you're going to implement, those are the solutions. So if you have cost-conscious clients, you're going to be focusing on solutions that are going to manage or mitigate some of the cost. Regardless of if your customers are internal or external, it is critical that you communicate with them. They're your eyes and ears. So if you are communicating adequately and regularly with your clients, you'll know if what you're doing is working. You'll know if you've identified the right key priorities. You'll know if the strategies are being effective. And if you don't, it doesn't hurt to come straight out and ask. Clients don't often shy away from, people who want partnerships and people who want to collaborate. Little changes can impact perception that your client has of you. They can impact perception of your programs. They can impact the outcomes. So remember, as we go through the rest of this presentation, those are some of the key factors to keep in mind for how you're going to use what we cover next to build a business case that's going to help you support the use of technology to your clients and to your company. So everybody has heard people, process, technology. Anyone in the e-discovery space is familiar with that phrase. Understanding how the systems work will make sure that you get better results. So the systems are important, but I don't want to gloss over the importance of process and technology. So, we need to understand how the system works. We also have to know the process and the people, which is where the second bullet point comes into play. That when you're communicating to people who are unfamiliar with this technology, it is important, and I would even say critical, that you use simple terms that everyone can understand. To me, one of the best indicators of whether somebody knows what they're talking about is if they can explain it to a fourth grader. If you need to use jargon, if you cannot reiterate in your own words, to me, there's a chance that you don't understand the processes that are going on. So if you can break it down into simple language that people understand, give them visual examples, give them relevant examples, then you're going to be in a better position to have effective use of technology. Which is exactly what this next point says. It's okay to oversimplify things to make sure that people get the picture. Some of the things I'm going to show you here would probably make math and stats people's heads spin. You've got a lot of complex words. You've got, vectors and algorithms and supervised and unsupervised machine learning, and what's an illusion rate and what's the illusion test and rank and cal and tar and clustering. And I just threw out a whole bunch of words. And to people who don't know what this technology means or what any of that means, all of a sudden they're not listening because this obviously doesn't apply to them, or they're too far gone. This is not going to be appropriate or applicable to what they're doing, or it's just too complicated. So none of these words need to be used if you understand the technology and can explain it. So that's technology in general. That's kind of the whole legal tech. Now, analytics, various aspects of AI, are the most powerful if you take the inputs that you have. So if you think about the textbook, and when you open the user manual for the software that you're using, it's going to say, to use clustering, follow step 1, 2, 3, and 4. To use tar, follow steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. What they don't tell you is that the amount that you customize your input is going to significantly improve and increase the utilization of what you get on the other side of that. So I'm going to give you guys a few ideas of how I do that in the following slides, because I think that you'll see how critical it is to truly make sure that you are thinking about your outcomes and looking to what your goals are. You know, we talked about priorities. We talked about the dilemmas that your clients are facing. If you look at using analytics from the end and work backwards, you're going to come to a very different position than if you start at clustering and try to plan how you're going to get to an end result that you can use. But if you simply work backwards, you'll find you have a lot more success. So if you have been in eDiscovery for more than 5 minutes, garbage in, garbage out applies to everything in this industry. Again, customizing your input is important, but it's even more important that you're picky about what goes in when you're using analytics. The other thing that I would really, really like to emphasize is there are a ton of uses other than those that are in the manual. And I think specifically not just to individual uses, but to ways that you can use different pieces of analytics concurrently. An example would be if you are doing a Cal project. And this is actually something I've used in a slide in the past. But if you are doing let's say a TAR 1.0 project, and you come across a set of documents that are particularly responsive to the damages issue, you could just continue doing TAR. And you could just go through the linear workflow the way that it's outlined in the book. Or you could continue doing TAR, but on the side, add this little subcategory of work where you use clustering or where you use categorization. And in a case like that, what you could do is build a category of those documents that are responsive to the damages issue, pull the rest of the database using those as examples, and do that review on the side. You've not impacted your TAR project. You can continue doing your workflow, but instead of waiting for those documents to land on your lap, you went out and got them. And there's nothing wrong with using technology concurrently like that. Or at the start of a Cal project, if you don't have a seed set, there is no harm in running searches to try to find key documents that you can pre-review, or using clustering to try to find pieces of documents, themes of documents that you review ahead of time so that you're feeding the system something to start with. You don't have to do that, but all of these things are options. And the more, I'm a really big believer that the more effort you put in at the start, the better the outcome is going to be. And it plays a lot to the idea of just general project management across every industry, which is if you don't plan, you will fail. And well, eventually the technology, something like Cal, is going to get you there. You may be able to streamline the process by making sure that you invest your time and your energy up front. I should have pressed the next button first. Mix and match different tools. You can use them concurrently. Okay, so concept, we're going to talk just for a minute about conceptual analytics, and then we will get into categorization, so things like Cal and TAR. But to think of concept space, I want you to think of a three-dimensional graph. So X, Y, and Z. If you think about mapping a piece of food, let's say tacos. I like tacos. It's Tuesday. I think it's Tuesday. If you think about tacos and the x-axis is your temperature of food, tacos would fall to the warm or the hot. And then if you think of the y-axis as sweet, tacos would fall fairly low on that category. And then if you think of the z-axis as spicy, they would fall potentially somewhere in the middle. You've now put a taco in a three-dimensional space based on its characteristics. Every single food could be plotted in that same three-dimensional space. Think of, this is one of those vast oversimplifications that statisticians would not love, I'm sure, but I think it's important to give you an example that you can relate to, because it's hard to think of the different pieces of a document that could relate to these different dimensions. If you think of every document like food, it shares a number of criteria. It has different criteria than other pieces. And those documents, those pieces of food, get mapped to different sections in this three-dimensional space. So with that in mind, and with understanding that that's an oversimplification of how it works, I want to draw your attention to this word map. Now, this is a visual representation of what an analytics conceptual index could look like. No, this is not what it looks like, but I think that this is important to represent something. Now, anyone who's familiar with email footers and email headers will recognize a lot of the things that are in this. And you'll also notice that they are the most dominant pieces of this word cloud. Confidential information, that sounds like something in an email signature. Name, addressee, email, system manager, intended recipient, individual. All of those words fall in people's email footers. They fall in the header of an email. They're not truly content. So let's imagine that we've made an index of the entire database. This is what you're going to get. You're going to get a lot of noise. And the noise is predominantly what you're going to have as the biggest piece or the most relevant, most repetitive content. So I took the exact same paragraphs and I created a new index. And this index excludes all the email signatures and the email headers. And you'll see all of a sudden a lot more content starts showing through, a lot more true to what I was intending content is visible. But there's also all these sports teams, and I didn't mean to do that. So what we can do is we can then run another index. This is still on the database, but I've now taken the content and I've created a new index, eliminating what was misleading each time. And now I'm left with this third index. It has the fewest number of documents, but the language that I was looking for is the most prominent inside of this index. A lot of people don't make those fine-tuned adjustments, but I'm going to tell you why it's so important. If you take this document that you see right here, if I map that in its three-dimensional space based on the first index, that first word cloud, it may land in this top left quadrant. On the other hand, if I took the exact same document and I mapped it into the three-dimensional space using the most accurate index, it may be in a totally different location. As you can imagine, moving documents around is also going to move around their neighbors. So the reliability of something like a cluster that uses this index, when you're using the index that is up top, the one with all the kind of noise, will be very, very different than using a cluster that is based on the data from the clean index. So if you're looking to do something like cluster my emails, you're going to want to look at maybe building an index just of my documents instead of building an index of the whole database. Yes, you could then filter to my documents, but those indexes are going to be very different because one will have just my language patterns and the other one will have all the language patterns from the entire database. So I point this out because one of the things that I find most people do is they follow the instructions on how to create a cluster. And while they will tell you to make sure that you clean the data and there's no noise data in there, what they don't necessarily tell you is how much different the outcomes can be if you make sure that your index is representative of the sample you're trying to visualize. So I hope that made sense. I really like those visualizations. So let's talk about categorization now. And if you think of categorization, what this actually is providing the computer with a group of documents that you would like to concept search based on. So instead of taking a single paragraph and using the concept search feature, you're taking several documents and using the concept search feature. This is actually what's happening in the background of Cal. When you mark a document as responsive, that gets provided to Cal as an example of a yes document. When you mark something not responsive, it gets added as an example of a no document. And then the more that you add, the more it builds a picture of what is yes and no. Now, you can actually do that with categorization outside of Cal, but there's a few important things to think about. So I want to bring your attention to this. Probably looks the same as the last document because I think it is. And I've highlighted a few pieces of information here. Let's pretend that this is a employment contract. Every single person in the company is going to have the exact same employment contract, but there's going to be a few key differences. The name, probably the salary, the title of the position, the date, those are going to be different. When me as a reviewer is looking at this document, those are the pieces of information that I'm relying on to determine that this is a responsive document. When I see the exact same contract on the other side, and that is not a person I'm interested in, that's not a job I'm interested in, that's not a date I'm interested in, I mark this document as not responsive. I want to remind you that when you're using conceptual and categorization, when you're using those types of analytics, you want to provide the system with documents that fully represent the concept that they're defining. And what that means is that single terms, individual terms, phrases, and individual sentences do not convey enough content for analytics to learn anything. You're looking for 1 to 2 fully developed paragraphs. And the reason that that's important is when Cal looks at the document that you just reviewed, one which you marked relevant and one which you marked not, it actually doesn't see those things. It sees everything else. It sees the average of the document. It sees the volume of the document. Those little minutiae that you as a human are using to distinguish if a document is relevant or not are details that this kind of technology doesn't learn. Or it takes so many documents before they would be able to learn that you would have essentially not have simplified the process in any way, shape, or form. So when you look at something and when you code it, you want to make sure that you're actually telling the computer what you want to be telling the computer. Now, this is important because a lot of people try to kind of cheat Cal. I often see people who say, well, Cal is looking for this, so I marked it this way. Cal isn't looking for anything. You're providing examples to Cal. And when you try to kind of manipulate and cheat the system and you submit things as examples to one bucket or the other, you may actually be throwing things off course. So from the business case perspective, we'll get back to why this is so important in a second. But what Cal sees is that you've marked the exact same document as responsive and not responsive. So now if you think of it as 1 point for yes and 1 point for no, this document still, the system doesn't know what to do with. So I'm a big believer in using responsiveness to designate whether Cal should get you more like this or not, and having a second field that designates relevance or producibility, because that would allow you to mark every one of these employment contracts as responsive, meaning, yes, I would like to see more of these. I'd like to continue seeing documents that share these language patterns, but I can then mark only the ones that will be produced, only the people I care about, as relevant and producible. So now that you understand the technology, using metrics to demonstrate the advantages of it is one of probably the most powerful things that you can do. And I'm going to show you some examples. Now that you understand the technology, you need to understand why your clients and your case teams are reluctant or why they're apprehensive. So the thing I hear most often is, I don't want decisions being made inside a black box that I'm not privy to. So the first thing is, there are no decisions being made in the black box. You are putting inputs, the system is organizing things, and from there you can choose if you'd like to review it all, if you want to review some, if you're going to trust what the system categorized. But all of these things are provided to you as a way to determine if you're comfortable. And then the stats that come with the software provide you with a realistic understanding of what could be left behind. So understanding why your case teams are reluctant is like an absolute critical first step in making sure. But if somebody comes to you with a reluctance and you don't understand the technology, it's very, very difficult to provide them with some kind of comfort into why or why not that will actually be an issue. So think a little bit about a client who is concerned that Cal is going to miss documents. The business case for how and why you would use the technology anyways. And a few years ago, sidebar, a few years ago, I did the keynote at the iPro conference about this, about teaching your case teams to use analytics and how we had successfully implemented the use of it. And a fire alarm went off in the middle of my presentation. And then I had to come back on stage. And the timing was good though, because I was actually at a pivot point between give them free lunches, which was my slide that the fire alarm went off on, and what we did from there, which was actually implementing the technology without them knowing. And I'm not saying that was misleading. So it wasn't without them knowing, it was without them committing to it. So in the case of Cal, if you have somebody who's uncomfortable using Cal, what you can do is suggest that you use the prioritized queue and they review, and that they have the option of continuing to review every single document in the database, that there will be no requirement that they stop when Cal is finished, that they can just continue working. And that kind of use of technology, kind of without them committing to it, without them putting all their eggs in that basket, is really, really effective, because in the 3 different times that I've had clients who've used that method, I have never once had somebody actually review the entire database, because by the time they got down to a certain point and hadn't seen a responsive document in like 5,000 documents, they realized that, I'm going to make up a number, 50,000, that everything that was left probably followed the same patterns. And then we ran an illusion test. And what an illusion test is it calculates the probability of documents that are in your no bucket being relevant but having been missed. So your no bucket is, of course, made up of documents that matched language patterns to documents that were coded as not responsive. Now, if you run an illusion test and you have a sub 1 score or sub 0.5 score, the probability that anything has been missed is very, very low. And at some point, people become comfortable, even the biggest skeptics become comfortable that you have not taken any quality out of the review. Even if you don't pull up the statistics about the ratio of errors to human review versus technology, if you don't pull up any of that statistic or any of those statistics, you will still have the biggest skeptics take Cal in that manner and probably get to the same place that I've experienced, which is, oh yeah, I am seeing that there's nothing good left. And in that case, you've actually taken somebody and you've said, go ahead and review these in what you're perceiving to be linear. You just click next, next, next. This is a linear review. But what you don't see is that the system in the background is getting you the good stuff. So understanding the reluctance and figuring out how to put technology into their hands anyways is one of the most powerful tools. And I have to say, it was probably the biggest success that we were able to do when I was implementing tech and when we were selling it to clients. And I don't mean selling, but like literally when we're communicating to clients, hey, we want to use email threading on your file. No, we don't want anything missed. Okay, let us run email threading anyways. And then we'll start with the inclusives, and then we can just review everything else later. We can still look at everything. And everybody's like, yeah, okay. You get through all that stuff, you show them the documents you found, and everyone's like, yeah, that's good, let's stop there. So that kind of, way of bringing comfort to people when you're using technology can be really, really helpful. Now, I'm certainly not encouraging that you deceive anybody. That is obviously against everything that we kind of stand for. But I am suggesting that you ask them to follow the process that they would have followed while layering technology on top of it. And then if they choose to use the results, it's an advantage. And if they don't, then it is exactly the same as if you had done nothing. So another hesitation that I see quite often is, well, how do I explain or how do I trust something like Cal and its predictions? And the truth is that it is a much more complicated statistical model than I even understand. There's a whole bunch of words. They're very, very confusing. But I understand Cal very well. So you don't actually need to know all of that crazy, insane language. You don't have to know all the math that goes behind it. What you have to understand is that as you review documents, you give it examples of stuff you want to see. You give it examples of things you don't want to see. And from there, Cal will distribute the documents into one of those buckets or leave them in the middle, which means it didn't know what to do with them. The most simple way to confirm the accuracy, if you have people who are hesitant, is to build them samples out of all the buckets, out of the middle, get them to review everything in the middle because Cal didn't know what to do with those. The no bucket, we have illusion tests to cover that, but some people like to see along the way that some sampling is done out of, what I call the no bucket for simplicity. Use those kinds of tools to alleviate the concern that comes with using these technologies. See, I'm just talking ahead of my bullet points. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to give you an example. And we do this quite often. We use this with all kinds of calculations when we're doing it internally. When I was at the firm, I did this all the time to figure out. We create things like this to show our clients the difference between using technology and not. So I'll give you an example of 500,000 documents at 50 documents an hour. The cost to review the entire thing at $250 associate rate is $2.5 million. Now, if we reduce the population by 70% using active learning and other analytic tools, we're now down to 150,000 documents, which decreases the cost to 750,000. Now, a $1.7 million savings is really, really hard to ignore. We had previously talked about the fact that you can also layer these technologies on top of each other. So this is like a textbook utilization of this tool, but what you may be able to do and what you may do, and it might cost more and it might cost less, is also rely on things like search terms or categorization. That's the thing I used as an example where you could actually take sample documents, submit those, and concept search across the whole database for others that are like the examples you gave. You can layer those things on top of this kind of a process to either improve the efficiency or improve the confidence that your client has. Now, we also use this fairly often. Obviously, on an in-house review, you would have the associate rate. In a contract review, you would have the contract rate. So you can also demonstrate those kind of savings. So if you have a very cost-conscious client, you can take this technology, you can take your options, in-house versus vendor versus, the client doing some of the review, and you can mix and match all of these different pieces to fit inside of the financial model that your client is looking for. So I think that can be really, really helpful. These are some of like the metrics, the obvious metrics. These are easy to calculate. We know approximately how fast people can review. We know what an associate rate is. We know how many documents there are. So this is a really good starting point when you're scoping out a project, is to compare the apples to apples and figure out, where can we find cost reductions or where can we find other reductions. Now, other metrics that you may want to consider: richness based on a prevalence sample. Now, when you're deciding if you want to use Cal or if you want to use TAR, one of the key distinguishing factors is what is the richness of the data population? Because if the richness is very low, Cal takes too long to get there because Cal struggles to find enough yes documents to feed you in a prioritized queue. in a traditional TAR 1.0 model, which uses sample sets and then validation, and then you stick with the scores that you get, those samples that you're provided with aren't all predicted yes documents. They're actually a variety of documents from across the entire population. So you're going to get a good smear of yes and no documents inside of that. So in that case, something like a TAR 1.0 model would be a good fit, and maybe a CAL or like TAR 2.0 model wouldn't be nearly as effective. And the way that you do this is when you have your entire document population, you take that richness, or you take that prevalence sample, a sample of the documents, you review it, you determine the percentage that were yes documents, and then you can take that and statistically push that out across the whole volume of data and figure out how many documents are likely going to be relevant, what is the percentage in my whole database, and then you can make those kinds of decisions. One of my favorite and one of the most impactful, especially early on, is how many documents can I remove using threading? Threading is probably the least threatening mode of these analytics. And by now, I think just about everybody uses it, but I do still see hesitation on some client fronts. And that's just because, well, law firms and vendors do this every single day. Sometimes the client that comes to you is in their first litigation or their second litigation. So convincing them, if they're particularly involved, that this tech is good, this is a really good way of doing it, because you can directly put a cost savings to the 15% of documents that you can weed out this way. Clustering is what I think to be one of the most underutilized tools. And is a fantastic way to build a business case for using analytics on a matter. Think of clustering as your bird's eye view of everything that is inside your workspace. But those examples that I gave you of the indexes, the quality of the index being so important, if you don't do that, clustering is not effective, and you will get frustrated with it, and you will wonder how come T2X, I'm in Alberta, so T2X is always one of your clusters, but that's because things like email footers are still included. So if you don't clean out your index, the results that you get are going to be poor. But if you do, if you put in the time and the effort to remove repeat content and take out, known keywords that are garbage like TeamSnap and LinkedIn updates and Air Canada flyers, if you take that stuff out and then you cluster, you get a nice bird's eye view of the content. And I like to rank it as potentially responsive, highly responsive, and potentially not responsive. And if nothing else, if you do nothing else in a review and you have a client who's incredibly hesitant, or you have, one of the lawyers is very hesitant, simply prioritize the data based on what you see when you look at the clusters and the language patterns that you see in those clusters, and start reviewing in that order. All of your high priority, all of your potential, all of your probably not documents. And you'll often find that when you do clustering, you can automatically take out one or two slices of that cluster pie, and you can take those right out, because they will be things like birthday parties and flag football, or they will be things like the City of Calgary updates that came through our corporate email accounts, or there's patterns to the data, and clustering is the easiest way to see that without having to provide any inputs. QC overturn rates. So this applies to whether you are doing the review internally, you're using a vendor, your client is helping. A QC overturn rate is a fantastic metric to help convince of quality. So depending on exactly what you're looking for and what you QC, if you're QCing only for relevance, you're going to have a lower overturn rate than if you're QCing for issues as well, because issues, those can change a lot. And if every time that somebody, I mark a document as damages and somebody else looks at it and says, oh, it's also liability. if you are taking that as an overturn, then your stats are going to be very, very different. So I would recommend that you consider the implications of what you were using as your stats, just a heads up, because that can very much be deceiving. But a QC overturn for relevance will tell you if the people that you are using for review are doing a good job, if additional training is required, and it can help you spot patterns in the quality early on. So we use this all the time, particularly at the very outset of review, after we've done the initial review of the pleadings and all the memos, because your perception of the data changes. And I think to like one example that comes up all the time is daily reports, for example. At the start of a file, we see daily reports and we realize that they speak to, you know, a number of things in the pleadings and we mark them relevant. But by day 3, we've seen 6,000 of them. And we realize that there was a weekly summary instead. So the kind of changes that organically happen over the life cycle of a review can be difficult the bigger the review team. So making sure that you are doing QC, that you're identifying these things and that you're retraining is particularly beneficial. But this overturn rate for people who are hesitant on quality can be a really good way to show that the technology and the people are lining up and that they're both coming to the same decisions. Ooh, I like this one. So privilege review is, okay, privilege review is a thing. It is a challenging thing. You can use email domains, you can use name searches, you can put eyes on every single document to review for privilege. But what you can also do is take your privileged documents that you do know of, categorize them, and look for ones that are conceptually similar. That is another way to leverage this technology. So if you have a case that has particular sensitivity around privilege, not every case is as sensitive, but if you have one that is, in addition to doing things like name searches, you can use these analytics to determine how many potentially privileged documents there are based on language similarity. So that's another stat that you can report, which is, you know, we found 250 documents that had privileged names. We found 100 documents that have privileged domains. We found 250 documents that were conceptually similar. And now you have kind of covered all of your bases because you've covered the people, the places, and the content of the document. So if you've ever done Cal, you've probably seen the relevance rank and the relevance rate graphs that are in Relativity. If you've used Relativity, every app has something like this, but this is Relativity is obviously the most common. So if you use the technology and you look at the reporting tools, you're going to see a few pieces of information. And for me, one of the stats that I like to report on is the relevance rank compared to the actual coding. So often what you'll see is documents that are responsive, they physically move on the graph over to the right-hand side, and that means that the prediction is yes. And then documents that are predicted as no, they slowly migrate to the left-hand side of the graph. But sometimes what you'll see is documents that are physically located to the right, which means that they're predicted to be yes, but that when a reviewer looks at them, they code that as no. So one of the metrics for quality and for reassurance that you can use is what is the ratio of documents that have disagreements between the coder and the computer's prediction. It's also something that you can add additional QC to because you want to determine, is there a reason that the technology and the person disagree, which is common, like just, you know, it's nothing to panic about, because in the example of those employment agreements, I would have marked those as, or the computer would predict that they are yes because they are all the same, and I've given it yes examples. But then I find the ones that don't apply and I mark them no. You expect to see some conflicts, but if you start seeing a lot of conflicts high up on the confidence levels of, you know, yes, this is a predicted yes document, that's something that you want to be aware of. The other thing is the relevance rate, which is the percentage of documents that the computer gives you that it expects you're going to mark as relevant. So not every document that is inside of Cal is actually meant to be yes. They include what's called index health documents. And those documents themselves are actually there to validate the no and to make sure that, it's keeping true to the spirit of the index. So the relevance rate shows you out of every 200 documents, how many of the ones that were meant to be yes were in fact coded yes. What you see is as you progress, that number really starts to drop. So one of the ways you can use that metric is to build a decision about cost benefit analysis. And we also use it to determine if we can wrap up Cal. Have we now seen enough documents, and are we getting so few return that this is no longer reasonable to continue? The illusion rate, of course, I said, is when you do Cal, you set a cutoff of where you want yes documents are on the right and no documents are on the left. The illusion test and the illusion rate look at everything in the no bucket, so everything to the left, and it does statistical sampling, and it tells you of the documents to the left, there is a potential that this many have been missed. The illusion rate is a great way to do efficiency metrics. It's a great way to do quality metrics, and it's a really great way to determine, it's the way to ultimately determine if you've been successful in your Cal project. So we talked about things to think about during the presentation. We talked about some of those like business ideals and things that you wanted to learn about and absorb through the presentation. And then we talked about some maybe indirect ways to use technology and ways that technology could be bent. I like to bend it to my will, that you could bend it to your will to make sure that what is coming out the other side is what you wanted to come out the other side. And I also hope that you were able to learn the odd trick about how you can improve the outcomes of using technology by putting, higher quality, better, more thoughtful inputs in. So now that you're masters, let's circle back to the actual business case. We talked about using technology, overlaying it over top, even if people are hesitant to use it. And, I was careful to say, like, we don't want to be deceitful. Transparency is one of the absolute most important pieces of building your business case, because if you have hesitancy to use the technology and you are not transparent and that becomes apparent, which it always does, the trust damage that you have done will make it even more impossible to trust the technology, even though it wasn't the technology that was being deceitful. Predictability is key when you're building a business. You have to mostly know that you can do A and then B will happen. Because if you are doing A and then Q happens and that's not what you intended, that can completely derail the trust and the reliability of that process. So you should know that an input is going to result in a certain output on the other side. Back to this language thing, you don't have to use big words. Speak the client's language and communicate regularly. So I am a really big fan of, I guess, probably, if anybody knows me, I like oversharing, I guess. I would communicate these statistics to you so that you could understand all the pieces. And I would communicate to you the steps that I took and why I took those steps. Because I also feel like by explaining often in transparent language, I can educate the client. And if they're more informed, then our relationship can be more collaborative. So speaking their language, using their dialogue, communicating often, that's a business case for a long-term partnership with a client or a lawyer at your firm, or whatever the relationship in the business that you're looking to build is. speaking their language and communicating builds collaboration. So acting in their best interest is what I hope everybody in this industry aims to do. The other thing is to give them options. So I walked you guys through a bunch of ways that I kind of bend the technology to do something different than what the book says. But at any point, you could use a number of these different options. And one thing that I find has been really helpful when I'm trying to build a relationship, when I'm trying to build a business case to use this tech, is to provide a number of different solutions. They can be varying risks. So what if we just used email threading? Here's the results. What if we just use clustering? Here are the results. What if we throw all the tools we have, we use Cal, we use clustering, we use that. What are the results? And then you can kind of add in there a metric. It's less of a metric, I guess, and more of like a subjective assessment. But what if you kind of rank those as risk? You know, how risk adverse are the different options, or how are those going to feel to your client? So giving them options and not simply putting them into one stream that they may not be comfortable with is a good way to kind of bridge that gap and build that relationship. I've said this a number of times. I love this, combining technologies. Sometimes, no matter how good you are at these things, you pick a technology and A did not in fact lead to B. It led to W or Q or, you know, D. Sometimes that is going to happen because we think of things in a very interactive way. When we look at that one document that I gave examples of with the highlighting, the different names and the different job titles, we're looking at that document differently than the computer looks at the document. So sometimes we think of the processes with our direction and with the kind of thought patterns that we put into these kind of things. So sometimes the computer is going to have a different outcome than what you planned. It is not the end of the world. Take a look at it, figure out maybe what went wrong, and readjust. If you had a good idea once, you can have a different good idea. But I think it's important that you identify when it is time to pivot and that you're just open and honest. Sometimes the technology doesn't work how we hope. Sometimes you try Cal and you just are not getting anywhere because the richness was lower than you thought. I've had that happen. It seemed like the richness would be high enough, but then it turned out that the kinds of documents that existed in the data set just were not working with how low the richness was. And we had to pivot, and we do that all the time. So don't feel like it's a failure if one of the methods that you take out into the world doesn't work out. So anyways, that's everything. Are there any questions?
You guys can speak up if you would like to unmute yourself to ask a question or put it in the chat. Just a little comment here. Thank you so much, Tiana, for that wonderful presentation. I actually read today that something about not using technology in your practice can be rather unreasonable in this day and age. And I really think that this seminar sort of does show that you can and should be using tech and why.
Come on, guys, throw me a hard question.
Come on, people. She loves a hard question. Crazy question.
I have a question.
Yep.
I missed. Hi, how are you doing? Very good presentation, by the way. Lots to think about. I don't use Relativity. I wish I did. But when you're talking about rebuilding indexes for certain sets of documents and stuff like that, is that a really easy functionality within Relativity? And how do you do that specifically?
Yeah, so it can be done in Relativity, it can be done in iPro, it can be done in any software. A conceptual index is always based on a saved search. So it is as simple as narrowing down the data that is inside your saved search, and then using whatever application you're in, going to the analytics build index and pointing it to the saved search. So it is a really simple process. So it's something that's kind of like maybe worth toying around with, you know, build an index based on this, based on this, based on this, and then visualize all of them and see how different it is, but it's a very simple process.
Great. And yes, I will be sending a copy of the recording to you, and we will be posting it as well as the slides. So everybody will have all of this wonderful information to fall back on. And any other questions before we wrap it up for the day?
Quiet group.
Being very quiet. Yeah, no kidding. You must have covered absolutely everything there was to know.
Absolutely, or else nothing I said made sense, I guess.
I have another question. You said you can do that in iPro, so but
in iPro and web.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have been specific.
All right. Well, I guess if there's no other questions, we will give you the extra minute back in your day. Thank you, Kiana, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining us today. Our next topic is going to be in November, and that notice will be coming out probably the next day or so. And I look forward to seeing you guys then too. Take care.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye.
Bye.